How could this move so quickly? The ruling at 10 o'clock yesterday morning, and now this.
Yeah, Trump's lawyers wasted no time in making their filing to have this case, thrown out. Basically, they had to ask the judge for permission to file a motion to have the verdict thrown out. And now the judge has accepted that and will set a hearing in order to parse the questions that have been raised in this case by the Supreme Court's immunity ruling.
Well, of course, the questions that have been raised not only pertain to what is an official act versus an unofficial private act, but also the way in which official acts can be used as evidence or anything done in a presidential capacity. Could that be potentially what trips up this already decided case where a verdict has already come down, but potentially some of that evidence may be in question? So
that is exactly the point. So the judge is going to have to review if there was evidence introduced before the jury that were part of his acts as president. So some of the issues they'll be looking at are tweets and social media posts that he made as president, testimony from White House staffers, and some of his financial filings. But in fact, the bulk of this case, as we know, involved actions that happened well before the election because it was about his effort to tamp down the story, so it wouldn't compromise his election. So, but all of this now has to be parsed. The judge is taking it very seriously. We're going to have filings from Trump's team next week on July 10th, where they will lay out, their issues. And then the prosecutor, Bragg, will then respond to those at a later date. So it's now a whole new dimension of this case that is unfolding before our eyes.
We heard from the president on this Supreme Court ruling, Joe Biden addressing what we heard from the Supreme Court in a late speech from the White House. He spoke just before 8 p.m. Here's what he said.
I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years. But any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent.
It's interesting in this case, Joe Biden, of course, may not be president come November. If Donald Trump is sentenced in September, and let's say that includes an ankle bracelet or some level of probation, would he then carry that with him into the White House? Would he be meeting with a probation officer, or would that stop at the White House gates? Well,
now with this new wrinkle of the immunity question, it's also possible that if Judge Merchan decides to go ahead with the sentencing, he would then it could be adjudicated on appeal and addressed on appeal. So it's very unlikely that a sentence will actually go into effect in the near term, and if Trump is elected before he gets into the White House. So obviously we still have to see how this case evolves, and there are a lot of surprises along the way. But most experts who are watching this aren't thinking that there's actually going to be a sentence in effect if he gets into the White House. It could be suspended. It will be addressed on appeal. So,
and of course, all of that is just this New York case. Right. The Supreme Court, at the heart of it was about the case against him here in Washington. We'll have to see how Judge Tanya Chutkan handles that going forward now that it's been remanded down to her. Bloomberg's Sara Forden, thank you so much for joining us. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reporting that President Biden will convene a Zoom meeting tomorrow with Democratic governors, including several rumored as potential replacements for the nomination, like California's Gavin Newsom and Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, as he tries to close ranks after his poor debate performance last week. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre briefed the media for the first time since then this afternoon.
We understand. We're not taking away from what you all saw or what the American people saw. We understand. It was a bad night. It is not uncommon for incumbents to have a bad night on their first debate.
She also said President Biden will speak with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries this week after one Democratic lawmaker broke ranks. Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas today making news, calling on Joe Biden to step aside in this race, writing in a statement, quote, "I represent the heart of a congressional district once represented by Lyndon Johnson. Under very different circumstances, he made the painful decision to withdraw. President Biden should do the same. While much of his work has been transformational, he pledged to be transitional," unquote.
Of course, while President Biden fields questions about his fitness for office, he is still carrying out his presidential duties, and he's set to hold a press conference next week as Washington hosts the NATO Summit. Russia's war in Ukraine and U.S. support for Ukraine will be chief among the topics discussed as world leaders gather. Here's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin after meeting with Ukraine's defense minister earlier today.
Now, as we look ahead to the NATO Summit next week, Rustem, we'll take steps to build a bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. Just weeks ago, President Zelensky and President Biden signed a crucial 10-year bilateral security agreement. And that reflects our strong and enduring support for Ukraine.
Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams is joining us now for more. He leads our national security coverage from here in Washington. So, Nick, we heard the defense secretary there talking about a bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. Are we likely to see tangible steps in that direction take place at this meeting next week?
No. So what's happening here is if you listen to that language, a bridge to membership, that in itself is a significant walk back from what the U.S. and allies had said before, and also what Ukraine wants. Ukraine wants a very specific plan, essentially a roadmap to membership. There has been a lot of debate and a lot of conversation behind the scenes among allies, NATO countries, about what they can tell Ukraine. And right now the answer is essentially they can't really say very much. So when you hear this language, a bridge to membership, I mean, that can mean almost anything you want. What they're essentially saying is, yes, we still think Ukraine should be a member of NATO at some point, but right now we're not going to give you a time frame, we're not going to give you a roadmap, we're not going to give you a way forward to how this goes. We're just telling you we want to do it, but we're not giving you any guarantees.
This summit comes at a peculiar time here for politics in the United States, never mind, say, France. Yeah. How do our allies in Europe have long-term conversations with Joe Biden, considering the one that's being had here at home?
Well, the answer to that is, again, they don't. I mean, there is the huge cloud looming over this summit, which is the possibility of a Donald Trump election. What we're hearing from the Trump campaign and people adjacent to him, Republicans who are pushing a sort of more conservative approach to NATO, would be, okay, we are not going to back out of NATO if Donald Trump wins, but we're not going to offer those security guarantees to countries unless they pay up, unless they meet that 2% of GDP target for defense spending. Of course, that's a kind of conversation that would completely roil the dialogue and the conversation we're going to see next week. So, I mean, the most interesting thing to me about this summit is this was a summit that was really meant to demonstrate will, demonstrate support for Ukraine, demonstrate resolve in the face of the Russian invasion. What you're essentially seeing is exactly the opposite. These leaders are not really going to be able to agree on a path forward for Ukraine. Joe Biden is hobbled by the debate performance. Emmanuel Macron hobbled by election results in France. So it's going to be a very shaky meeting.
And you're potentially going to have turnover, switch in power in the UK government after their election that comes up on Thursday. So it's a lot of world powers having power shifts within them all at once, perhaps. To what extent, as well, is this NATO summit about Russia as much as it is about those that are helping Russia, say China or others in this so-called axis of evil, as some have described it? To what extent do those feature into the NATO meeting?
Well, I think what you're going to see is obviously a message toward Russia saying, look, we want to project this aura of resolve, that Russia should not continue with the invasion, though it shows no signs of being deterred, but also a message to other countries, specifically China and Iran. Listen, do not continue to aid Russia in its invasion. The problem there is that we just see no sign that either China or Iran is interested in listening to that message. In fact, everything we're seeing is that China's cooperation with Russia, for example, is only deepening. So, again, a huge challenge for these leaders. In some ways, the summit comes at just the wrong time for them. So we'll have to see how it goes.
Sure sounds like it. You've got an interesting week coming up. Stay in touch with us.